Grattan, Guinness, and the Fall and Rise of the Jews. Much of Bible prophecy is concerned with God's chosen people, the Jews. Many people can't understand why there is so much attention given to the Jewish people, and I want to show how their fall and their rise is part of God's plan. Grattan Guinness was acutely aware of this, so this video draws on some of what he wrote about their centuries of persecution. Later videos will examine their recovery and return to their land. This is a process that God has ordained. Nations and dynasties rise and fall according to how they treat the Jews. An example of this can be seen in England. There has been no Anglo-Saxon king in England since Edward the Confessor because of his appalling treatment of the Jews. I've done a video on this called England and the Jews, which you can find on the website. Grattan Guinness wrote his book Light for the Last Days in 1888. Much of it was concerned with times and dates relating to the restoration of Israel. However, he also gives a graphic description of the fall and rise of the Jewish people from the time of their expulsion from their homeland to the time of his writing. He considers a history that he divides into three parts. Firstly, from the restoration from exile in Babylon to the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus in 70 AD and the close of the Jewish war under Hadrian. It's worth noting that during this first period, all the tribes of Israel were scattered throughout the world. Then secondly, from the final dispersion of the Jewish people up to the middle of the 18th century, and thirdly, from the French Revolution to the late 19th century when Guinness wrote his book. I will look at this period in a later video. So Guinness does not dwell long on the first period, but he does give an account of how the sufferings under the Romans increased from 66 AD as the Romans reacted to various revolts among the Jews and finally destroyed the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. About 60 years later, the Jews recovered enough to launch another revolt, and this time the Roman Emperor Hadrian completed the work of the dispersion of the Jews among all the nations of the earth. The land itself became completely desolate and was called Palestine, meaning Philistine, as a deliberate insult to the memory of the Jewish homeland. The sufferings of the Jews grew ever greater as time went by. Particularly from the time of Constantine, the Jews became a condemned and persecuted sect, and the gloom deepened as the centuries went by. Guinness says that the rise of Norman power and the feudal system in Europe resulted in, quote, a period of 7 centuries of the most cruel oppression and profound degradation to the Jews in all the nations of Christendom. Rather than attempt to list all the degradations the Jews underwent in Europe, I will simply list some that occurred in England, where the condition of the Jews was peculiarly miserable. Up until the Jews were banished from the country in 1290 by Edward I, the Jews were incessantly victimized in the most cruel and unjust manner. The laws of Edward the Confessor established that the Jews and all their possessions belonged to the king. When a Jew died, all his property returned to the crown. If a Jew converted to Christianity, all his estate would be seized to prove the sincerity of their conversion. So, a Jew was persecuted simply for being a Jew, and if he converted to Christianity, he would lose all he owned. King John ordered that all Jews should be imprisoned until they made a full disclosure of what they owned. They would then be tortured to pay over enormous sums of money. One man in Bristol was ordered to have a tooth a day extracted until he paid 10,000 marks. Henry III demanded 20,000 marks from all Jews in 1241 AD. The story continued all over Europe. Banishment after banishment, extortion after extortion, massacre after massacre. It was only in the 17th century that there was a lessening in the oppressions and cruelties. One of the key events was the return of the Jews to England under Oliver Cromwell. I will examine this event in the next video. So thank you for listening. If you found this video interesting, you can find more information at prophecy-workshop.com.